The dawn fog clings to the hard stand at Kimbolton Airfield in Huntingdonshire on February the 20th, 1944, turning the rows of B-17 flying fortresses into ghostly silhouettes that emerge and disappear as the mist shifts in the cold morning air. Technical Sergeant Frank Bellamy kneels beside the No. 3 engine of a bomber designated Hell's Angel, his hands already numb, despite heavy gloves, conducting the pre-flight ground check that regulations require before every mission. The checklist is routine: oil pressure, fuel lines, ignition magnetos, propeller governor, a 5-minute procedure that every crew chief performs hundreds of times without discovering anything more significant than minor adjustments. Squadron commanders have been pushing maintenance crews to work faster, to get bombers airborne more quickly, to streamline procedures that seem redundant when aircraft have flown successfully the previous day. Some crew chiefs have started abbreviating their ground checks, hitting the major points, but skipping details that rarely reveal problems. Bellamy performs every step exactly as the manual specifies, not from rigid devotion to regulations, but from experience that has taught him that engines fail in unpredictable ways, that small anomalies often indicate larger problems developing, that 5 minutes spent on the ground can prevent catastrophic failures at 25,000 feet, where repairs are impossible and consequences are fatal. On this particular morning, during what should be a routine inspection of a routine engine that has operated flawlessly for 300 combat hours, Bellamy notices something that does not belong. A faint metallic residue on the oil drain plug, barely visible, easily missed, indicating wear patterns that should not exist in an engine this young. That observation, made during a ground check, that many would have abbreviated or skipped entirely, will lead to the discovery of a manufacturing defect affecting an entire production batch of engines, will prevent 18 bombers from experiencing catastrophic engine failures over Germany, where crews would have no option except bailout or death, and will transform how the 8th Air Force approaches the balance between operational urgency and maintenance thoroughness. To understand why a faint metallic residue mattered enough to trigger investigation, one must first comprehend what bomber crews faced in early 1944 and how engine reliability determined mission success or failure. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany required aircraft to fly for 8 to 10 hours in formations at high altitude, engines operating continuously at near maximum power in temperatures that ranged from minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit to high heat during combat, when pilots pushed throttles forward for evasive maneuvers. Wright R-1820. Cyclone engines that powered B-17s were remarkably reliable by the standards of 1940s technology, but they operated under conditions that tested every component relentlessly. Engine failures during missions were common enough that crews trained extensively for 3-engine operation. For the emergency procedures required when an engine had to be shut down and feathered to prevent windmilling that would create drag. Most engine failures resulted from battle damage or mechanical problems that developed gradually enough that pilots could shut down the affected engine and maintain controlled flight on remaining power. Catastrophic failures, where engines seized suddenly, where connecting rods punched through cylinder walls, where fires erupted that could not be extinguished, were less common but invariably fatal when they occurred deep in enemy territory, where altitude and distance made survival impossible. Bellamy had come to aircraft maintenance through practical experience rather than formal training that emphasized theory over application. Before the war, he had worked in a machine shop in Detroit, had learned to recognize the subtle indicators that machinery was wearing abnormally, had developed the tactile sensitivity that allowed experienced machinists to feel problems that measurements might not detect. When he examined the oil drain plug that morning and saw metallic residue, his response was not based on checklist procedures. The manual did not specify that trace metal in oil indicated problems, but rather on instinctive recognition that metal should not be present in amounts visible to the naked eye. Oil in healthy engines carried microscopic metal particles from normal wear, but those particles were too small to see without laboratory analysis. Visible metal meant something was wearing at rates that exceeded normal tolerances, that components were degrading in ways they should not, that the engine might be hours or days from catastrophic failure. The resistance Bellamy encountered when he reported his observation reflected operational pressures that pervaded 8th Air Force bases in early 1944. The bomber offensive was reaching its peak intensity, with maximum effort missions requiring every available aircraft to fly, with ground crews working double shifts to keep bombers operational, with commanders desperate to launch full-strength formations despite maintenance issues that in peacetime would have grounded aircraft for weeks. The squadron operations officer, reviewing Bellamy's report that Hell's Angel should be grounded for engine inspection, initially rejected the recommendation. The aircraft had flown yesterday without problems. The scheduled mission required maximum bomber strength. One sergeant's observation of trace metal in oil did not justify removing an aircraft from the mission roster when the engine ran smoothly during ground tests and showed no performance degradation. Bellamy could inspect the engine after the mission, could investigate whatever problem he thought existed, but the bomber would fly as scheduled because operational requirements overrode maintenance concerns unless clear safety issues could be demonstrated. The sound of the right cyclone at full power became the symbolic element that defined what Bellamy's ground check represented. That deep, thrumming roar of 18 cylinders firing in sequence, a sound that bomber crews associated with reliability and strength, that ground crews heard differently because they understood the mechanical violence occurring inside those cylinders. The controlled explosions happening thousands of times per minute, the forces that stressed metal to its limits and occasionally beyond. That sound, familiar and reassuring to most personnel on the airfield, was to Bellamy's trained ear a diagnostic tool, something he could listen to for subtle irregularities that indicated developing problems. But you could not hear problems that had not yet manifested in engine performance, could not detect, through sound alone, the wear patterns that trace metal in oil revealed, could not rely on familiar reassurance when unfamiliar evidence suggested something was wrong. The transformation began when Bellamy, faced with rejection of his recommendation to ground Hell's Angel, escalated his concerns to the group maintenance officer, a decision that violated protocol and risked disciplinary action for breaking the chain of command. Captain Robert Chen, responsible for maintenance across the entire bomb group, reviewed Bellamy's report with skepticism that reflected his engineering background and statistical training. Trace metal in a single engine's oil did not indicate systemic problems might be explained by contamination during the last oil change, did not meet the threshold for grounding an aircraft when operational requirements were critical. But Chen also recognized that experienced crew chiefs developed instincts that formal training did not provide, that dismissing concerns without investigation was poor practice, even when those concerns seemed unlikely to be significant. He authorized a detailed inspection of Hell's Angel's No. 3 engine, not because he believed Bellamy's fears were justified, but because confirming they were unfounded would take only a few hours and would validate or disprove concerns before they escalated. The inspection revealed what Bellamy had suspected and Chen had doubted. When mechanics disassembled the engine and examined internal components, they found wear patterns on connecting rod bearings that indicated insufficient lubrication, grooves on crankshaft journals that should have been smooth, metallurgical evidence that components were failing at rates that would lead to catastrophic seizure within hours of additional operation. The engine had not yet failed, because wear had not progressed far enough to prevent operation. But the trajectory was clear. Within 50 to 100 hours of additional flight time, the bearings would degrade beyond the point where they could maintain oil films between moving parts. Metal would contact metal directly. Friction would generate heat that would expand components beyond their clearances, and the engine would seize. When a Wright cyclone seized at operational power, the sudden stoppage of a component rotating thousands of times per minute generated forces that connecting rods could not tolerate. Rods would break, punch through cylinder walls, potentially cause fires that would spread to fuel tanks in the wings. Crews flying aircraft when this failure occurred would have perhaps 30 seconds between recognizing the problem and losing control. 30 seconds to decide whether to bail out or attempt emergency landing. 30 seconds that were rarely sufficient to prevent tragedy. The critical discovery came when maintenance personnel investigated why this particular engine showed wear patterns that should not exist in a relatively new power plant with only 300 operational hours. The engine's serial number indicated it was part of a production batch manufactured at Wright's Cincinnati plant during September 1943, during a period when production had been accelerated to meet increasing demands for bomber engines. Further investigation revealed that this batch had been assembled using connecting rod bearings from a subcontractor who had deviated from specifications in ways that quality control had not detected. The bearings met dimensional requirements, but were manufactured from steel alloy that lacked the hardness characteristics necessary to withstand the stresses of sustained high-power operation. The defect was subtle enough that engines performed normally during acceptance testing, developed normally during initial operational hours, but began experiencing accelerated wear after approximately 300 hours when surface hardening wore through and exposed softer core material to bearing loads it could not tolerate. The mathematical implications were immediate and terrifying. Wright's Cincinnati plant had produced approximately 2,000 engines during the period when the defective bearings were used. Of those 2,000 engines, roughly 400 had been installed in B-17s operating with the 8th Air Force. Of those 400 engines, approximately 180 had accumulated 300 or more operational hours and were therefore approaching the failure threshold that Hell's Angel's engine had revealed. Squadron operations officers reviewing the data realized they were operating bombers that could experience catastrophic engine failures without warning, that crews were flying aircraft with time bombs attached to their wings, that the next major mission could result in multiple losses from mechanical failures that would be indistinguishable from enemy action. The response required by this discovery disrupted 8th Air Force operations for nearly 2 weeks. Every bomber equipped with engines from the suspect production batch had to be grounded, engines inspected or replaced, aircraft returned to service only after mechanical integrity was verified. Mission planners, accustomed to launching 400 bomber raids, found themselves operating with reduced forces as maintenance personnel worked around the clock to inspect and replace engines. The operational impact was substantial enough that some commanders questioned whether the grounding was justified, whether statistical probability of failure was high enough to warrant removing so many aircraft from service simultaneously. The mathematics supported the grounding. If 10% of suspect engines failed catastrophically during a single mission, and if each failure resulted in aircraft loss, the Bomber Command would suffer losses equivalent to a major raid against heavily defended targets, except these losses would occur from preventable mechanical failures rather than enemy action. The 18 bombers eventually identified as having engines within hours of catastrophic failure, aircraft that would have been lost with all crew if Bellamy's observation had been dismissed and the defective engines had been allowed to continue operating, represented more than statistical casualties prevented. Each bomber carried 10 crewmen, meaning 180 lives preserved through investigation that began with 5 minutes spent examining an oil drain plug. The crews who flew those aircraft never knew how close they had come to death, never understood that the routine maintenance procedures they took for granted had prevented losses they never experienced because problems were discovered before they manifested. The only evidence of the averted catastrophe existed in maintenance reports and engineering analyses, in bearings worn to failure thresholds, in metallurgical studies that documented manufacturing defects, in statistical projections that calculated when failures would have occurred if engines had continued operating. The transformation in how 8th Air Force balanced operational urgency against maintenance thoroughness following this incident was gradual but fundamental. Before, the institutional pressure was always to fly, to maximize mission strength, to treat maintenance concerns as obstacles to operational requirements unless clear safety issues could be demonstrated. After, the recognition spread that maintenance crews possessed expertise that operations officers lacked, that 5 minutes spent on thorough ground checks could prevent losses that no amount of combat skill could avoid, that rushing through procedures to save time during pre-flight could waste lives during missions. Squadron commanders began emphasizing maintenance quality over speed, began trusting crew chiefs who raised concerns even when those concerns seemed unlikely, began understanding that experienced technicians developed instincts that formal procedures could not codify, but that proved accurate more often than statistical probability would predict. The sound of those Wright cyclones starting up each morning, that familiar roar announcing another mission beginning, carried different meaning after crews learned how close they had come to catastrophic failures that would have seemed like routine combat losses. That sound was not merely engines running, but rather thousands of components functioning within tolerances, bearings maintaining oil films, connecting rods tolerated stresses that approached but did not exceed design limits, metallurgy and manufacturing quality determining whether the reassuring roar would continue or would suddenly become the tearing shriek of catastrophic seizure. Ground crews heard that sound, knowing that their work during those 5-minute pre-flight checks was not bureaucratic compliance, but rather the difference between engines that completed missions and engines that failed over enemy territory where failure meant death. And so, we return to that foggy morning at Kimbolton, to Technical Sergeant Bellamy kneeling beside an engine that has operated flawlessly for 300 hours, conducting a ground check that many would abbreviate or skip, noticing metallic residue that should not exist. The observation takes perhaps 10 seconds. A glance at the drain plug, recognition that something is wrong, decision to investigate further, rather than dismissing the anomaly as insignificant. Those 10 seconds, nested within a 5-minute procedure, nested within daily maintenance routines that most personnel considered mundane and unglamorous, would cascade into discovery that prevented 18 aircraft losses and 180 deaths, would reveal manufacturing defects that affected hundreds of engines, would transform institutional culture around maintenance thoroughness. The metallic residue on that drain plug was not dramatic. No explosions, no visible damage, nothing that non-experts would recognize as significant. But it was evidence that experienced eyes could interpret, that careful procedures could detect, that thoroughness could transform from bureaucratic compliance into life-saving intervention. The 5 minutes Bellamy spent on his ground check that morning, the 5 minutes that operational urgency pressured him to abbreviate, represented the difference between preventable catastrophe and continued survival for crews who would never know they had been saved. And in that difference lies a truth about warfare and technology and the relationship between those who fly and those who maintain, that the most critical moments are often the least dramatic, that the most important discoveries emerge from routine procedures performed with care rather than spectacular interventions, that the sound of engines running normally reflects thousands of human hours spent ensuring that normal operation continues, that behind every successful mission are maintenance procedures performed correctly by personnel whose names never appear in combat reports, but whose work determines whether crews return or die for reasons that would forever remain unexplained if problems were not detected before they manifested in catastrophe. The fog that morning at Kimballton eventually lifted, as fog always does, revealing bombers that would fly missions and return because someone spent 5 minutes checking what others might have rushed through, because metallic residue barely visible to the naked eye was recognized as evidence of problems that expertise could interpret, because operational urgency was balanced against maintenance thoroughness by leaders willing to ground aircraft based on concerns that could not yet be proven, but that experience suggested were real. And in the balance between urgency and caution, between flying maximum strength and ensuring aircraft were safe to fly, between operational requirements and maintenance recommendations, the decision to investigate rather than dismiss, to ground rather than fly, to trust expertise rather than pressure for speed, saved lives in quantities that could be calculated precisely, but whose human meaning extended far beyond numbers to include families who never received telegrams, crews who completed tours and returned home, futures that continued because problems were detected during 5-minute ground checks that someone insisted on performing thoroughly, even when institutional pressure urged him to work faster and skip the details that seemed unlikely to matter until on one foggy morning at one airfield, they mattered more than anything else in the world.